She was a thing made of dust and blood, left in the dry throat of a creek bed where the sun had come to bake the stones white. Her breath was a faint stirring of air, a moth's wing against the heat. The wound in her side was a dark, weeping mouth, crusted with dirt and flies. She did not move when the shadow fell over her. Only her eyes, black and deep as a struck well, flickered toward the shape of the man. They held no fear, no pleading. They held nothing at all, just a reflection of the endless, indifferent sky. Elias saw her from the ridgeline, a smudge of color against the pale earth that did not belong. He had been tracking a coyote that had gotten bold, but the tracks faded as he drew closer to the creek. He reined in his horse, a big roan that shifted its weight with a soft snort, tasting the air. Down below, the stillness was absolute. It was the stillness of a thing that had given up. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the loose gravel. The man himself seemed carved from the same hard land, all sun-cracked leather and sinew, with eyes the color of a faded blue shirt that had seen too many summers. He carried whole winters in those eyes, a quiet frost that never quite melted. He moved slow, deliberate, the way a man does when he has learned that hurry is a fool's game. He knelt beside her. The smell of blood was sharp, coppery, an offense to the clean scent of dust and dry sage. She was Apache, that much was clear from the beadwork on the fringe of her torn dress and the make of her moccasins, one of which was missing. She was young, barely a woman, her face a mask of dried mud and pain, her black hair tangled with burrs and bits of twig. Her skin was hot to the touch, a dry, unhealthy fire. "You hurt." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound unused to the open air. Her lips, cracked and pale, parted, but no sound came out. Only that flicker in her eyes, a spark of life refusing to be stomped out. Elias looked around. There were no tracks but her own, dragged and scuffed, telling a story of a long, desperate crawl. No sign of a struggle here. She had been left, or she had escaped to here, only to be cornered by her own failing body. It made no difference. The end result was the same. He had a choice. The prairie was full of choices, most of them hard. He could leave her. The coyotes he had been tracking would find her before nightfall. It was the way of things. The land was unsentimental, took what was weak. He had learned that lesson years ago, a lesson carved into a small wooden cross on a hill overlooking his cabin. But the girl's eyes held him. They did not ask for anything, and in their asking for nothing, they seemed to demand everything. He thought of Sarah, of the fever that had taken her, how her skin had burned just like this. He had been helpless then, a bitter, useless feeling. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the soles of his boots, he uncorked his canteen. He wet a corner of his neckerchief and gently, carefully, began to wipe the grime from her face. She flinched at the first touch of water, a tremor running through her thin frame, but she did not pull away. He dribbled a little water onto her lips, and her tongue, dry as a leaf, darted out to catch the moisture. He looked at the wound. It was deep, angry. He was no doctor, but he knew infection when he saw it. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her was a risk. His life was a quiet, brittle thing, a routine of chores and silence built to keep the grief at bay. She was a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples would change everything. He made his decision not with his head, but with his hands. He tore a strip from his own spare shirt in his saddlebag, soaked it in water, and laid it gently over the gash. Then, with a grunt of effort, he slid his arms under her, one beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of sharp bones and fevered skin. She made a sound then, a soft gasp, like a small animal caught in a trap. He carried her to his horse. The roan sidestepped, its eyes wide, smelling the blood. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, his voice low and steady. He managed to swing himself into the saddle, settling the girl across his lap. She was limp, her head lolling against his chest. Her breath was a hot puff against his shirt. As they rode, the dust lifted behind them like ghosts, and the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and blood orange. He did not look back. He just held on to the fragile weight in his arms and rode toward the solitary light of his cabin. A single yellow eye in the vast, darkening landscape. The cabin was a simple, stark thing, built of hewn logs chinked with mud and time. It had one room, a stone hearth, a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. It smelled of wood smoke, old sorrow, and solitude. He laid her on his own bed, the only soft place in the entire house. The cornhusk mattress rustled under her weight. He worked by the flickering light of a tallow lamp. He boiled water, his movements economical and practiced. He washed the wound as best he could, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. She was unconscious now, or something close to it, lost in the fever. He found a jar of salve Sarah had made years ago from comfrey and yarrow. It was probably useless now, but it was all he had. He spread it around the edges of the angry flesh and bandaged it with clean strips of cloth torn from one of Sarah's old chemises he found packed away in a trunk. He pulled a small stool to the bedside and sat, watching her. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind began to rise outside, a low moan that seeped through the cracks in the logs. In the unsteady light, her face seemed impossibly young. A child. He had brought a dying child into his home. He wondered what her name was. He wondered who had left her. He wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He pushed the thoughts away. They were pointless. He had done what he had done. Now, all he could do was wait to see if the dawn would come for her. For 3 days, she hovered in the gray space between life and death. Elias moved around her like a ghost in his own home. He spooned broth, thin and watery, between her lips. He kept the bandage clean. He sat with her through the nights, listening to her fevered muttering in a language that sounded like running water over stones. He rarely slept, catching an hour here and there in a chair by the dying fire, his shotgun across his lap. The habit of vigilance was old and deep. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her eyes open. They were clear. The fever had broken. She was watching him, her gaze steady, unblinking. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical presence. He stood and ladled some water from the bucket into a tin cup. He held it out to her. She looked at the cup, then at his hand, then back to his face. Slowly, she reached out a thin, trembling hand and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and her skin was cool. She drank, long and deep, then handed the cup back. Their life fell into a new rhythm, unspoken and unwritten. He did not ask her questions. She did not offer any words. He moved his bedding to a pallet on the floor by the hearth, giving her the bed. He would rise before the sun, light the fire, and go out to do his chores. When he came back in for breakfast, a piece of dry bread and black coffee, he would find she had swept the floor with a broom he had made of twigs, or that she had folded the blanket on the bed with a neat precision that seemed innate. Section. She was a shadow in his house, quiet and unobtrusive. She moved with a liquid grace, even as she recovered her strength. Her wound began to heal, the angry red softening to a puckered scar. She never complained, never indicated pain. She simply endured it. One afternoon, he came in from mending a fence line, his hands raw and bleeding from the barbed wire. He went to the basin to wash, and when he turned, she was standing there, holding out the jar of salve. Her expression was unreadable. He hesitated for a second, then sat at the table and held out his hands. She took his large, calloused hand in her small ones. Her touch was feather-light. She carefully, methodically, applied the salve to the cuts and scratches. Her focus was absolute. In that moment, the cabin did not feel so empty. The silence was not one of loneliness, but of shared space. When she was finished, she simply placed the jar back on the shelf and retreated to her side of the room. Days bled into weeks. The sharp edges of autumn softened the land, turning the prairie grass to gold. He taught her things through action. He showed her how to work the butter churn, how to knead bread. Her first loaf was as hard as a river stone. He broke a piece off and chewed it with grim determination. She watched him, a flicker of something. Amusement? Shame? In her eyes. He pointed to the chickens. Eggs, he said, tapping his own chest. For me, then he pointed to her. She looked at him, then at the chickens, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. It transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the girl who existed beneath the trauma. The next morning there was an egg by his plate. One evening, a storm rolled in, a great, bruised belly of a cloud that burst over the plains. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind screamed like something in agony. He saw her flinch with every crack of thunder, her hands clenched in the fabric of her mended dress. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the door as if she expected something terrible to burst through it. He got up without a word and slid the heavy iron bolt across the door. It was a gesture he never made. He did not lock his doors. He had nothing worth stealing, and he believed a lock was just an invitation to a determined man. But tonight, the sound of the bolt sliding home was a comfort. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. He went back to his chair by the fire, and they listened to the storm together. He found her one day standing by the small, weathered cross on the hill. She had her back to him, a still, dark figure against the wide sky. He walked up the slope, his boots silent on the damp earth. He stopped a few feet away. In her hand, she held a single, stubborn prairie wildflower. She did not seem startled by his presence. After a long moment, she knelt and placed the flower at the base of the cross. She traced the carved name with her finger. Sarah. Elias felt his throat tighten. It was the first word he had ever heard her speak in his language. Her voice was low, soft, like the wind through dry grass. He cleared his throat. My wife, he said. The words felt strange, dug up from a long-buried place. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a deep and ancient understanding of loss. She did not need to ask. She knew what it was to have a ghost living beside you. She stood, wiped the dirt from her knees, and walked back toward the cabin, leaving him alone with the memory and the small, bright offering of the flower. The first snow came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that clung to the world and silenced it. The isolation deepened, the cabin becoming an island in a sea of white. The routine became their anchor, the chopping of wood, the banking of the fire, the smell of stew, the mending of clothes. They were stitching their lives together with raw, plain thread. He realized one night, watching her mend one of his shirts by the firelight, her head bent in concentration, that he could no longer imagine the cabin without her. Her presence had filled the empty spaces he hadn't even known were there. The house, which had been a shell holding his grief, had started to breathe again. It was a morning sharp with frost when he saw them. 3 riders, cresting the eastern ridge. They were not cowboys. They were not soldiers. They were Apache. They sat on their horses, still as statues, watching his cabin. His hand went to the shotgun propped by the door. The girl was standing by the window, her body rigid. He could see the fear in the line of her back. Stay inside, he said, his voice a low command. He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, took the shotgun, and stepped out into the biting cold. The snow crunched under his boots. He did not walk toward them. He stood his ground in front of his home, the gun held loosely, pointing at the ground. A statement. This is my land. After a long moment, one of the riders, an older man with a face like a weathered rock formation and long braids threaded with silver, urged his horse forward. The other 2 stayed back. The man rode slowly, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the lean-to, the small curl of smoke from the chimney. He stopped 20 feet from Elias. The silence stretched, thin and brittle as ice. The Apache's eyes were black, intelligent, and searching. He looked at Elias, then at the cabin door. You are the man, the Apache said. His English was clear, deliberate. It was not a question. Elias nodded, his grip tightening slightly on the stock of the gun. What do you want? She is alive, the man said, gesturing with his chin toward the cabin. She is, Elias confirmed. The men who attacked our camp, the Apache continued, his voice flat, emotionless. They are dealt with. We tracked them. We found what they left behind. We thought she was with the spirits. Elias said nothing. He waited. You found her. You took her to your lodge. You tended her wounds. You gave her shelter from the storm. You shared your fire and your food. You kept her through the turning of the season. The old man recited the facts like a litany, each one a stone being placed in a foundation. I did what was decent, Elias said, his voice tight. The Apache looked at him, a long, measuring gaze. You do not understand our ways. I understand she would have died if I left her. To us? The old man said, his voice resonating in the cold air. What you have done is not just decency. A man finds a woman of our people, left for dead. He takes her into his home. He cares for her, protects her. He covers her with his blanket. He makes her part of his hearth. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. By our law, by our tradition, you have taken her as your wife. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The cold air rushed into Elias's lungs. Wife. The word was an explosion in the quiet landscape of his mind. He stared at the man, searching his face for some sign of a trick, a threat. He found only solemn conviction. That's not. Elias struggled for words, his own language failing him. I was just helping her. Your intention does not change the act, the old man said calmly. The act is the meaning. You have claimed her. She is yours, or you are hers. It is the same. Elias's mind reeled. He thought of her in his cabin, her quiet presence, the way she placed the egg by his plate, the way she had tended his hands. Had she known this? Had she been waiting for them to come? Was this some kind of trap? The cold suspicion was a bitter taste in his mouth. The cabin door opened. She stepped out, standing on the porch. She wore one of Sarah's old wool shawls over her thin dress. She looked small and fragile against the vast white backdrop. Her eyes were not on the riders. They were on him. The old man spoke to her in their language, his voice softer now. She listened, her face impassive. Then she answered, her own voice clear and steady. It was not a long speech, just a few sentences. But the authority in her tone was unmistakable. The old man turned his gaze back to Elias. She says you have been good to her. She says you have a quiet heart. She says this is her home now. The suspicion in Elias's chest dissolved, replaced by something far more complicated and terrifying. A choice. The riders were not here to take her back. They were here to affirm the bond, to see the man who was now her husband. I have nothing, Elias said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. I am a widower. This is a hard place. She is not a woman who needs soft places, the old man said. He gestured to the other riders, and one of them came forward, leading a pony. Tied to its saddle were blankets, cured hides, and parfleche bags filled with dried meat, corn, and herbs. A bride price, or a dowry, it did not matter. It was a seal on the bargain he had never intended to make. These are for her, the old man said, to help your lodge through the winter. We will not trouble you again. But know this, she is of the people. If she is ever harmed, we will know. If she is ever cast out, we will know it was both a promise and a warning. He looked one last time at the girl on the porch, then at Elias. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his horse and, with the other two riders, rode back over the ridge, disappearing as silently as they had come. Elias stood alone in the snow, the shotgun hanging heavy in his hand. The silence that descended was different now. It was filled with the echoes of words he did not understand and a future he could not comprehend. He was married, to a woman whose name he did not even know. He turned and looked at her. She was still standing on the porch, watching him. Her expression was the same as always, a quiet mask. But her eyes were waiting. He walked back to the cabin, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the world. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. The whole fragile structure of the life he had built around his grief was gone, shattered by an act of simple kindness. "I don't even know your name," he said, the words raw. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was still soft, but clear as a winter morning. "My people call me Istis," she said. "It means snow." He nodded slowly. Snow suited her. Quiet, beautiful, and utterly world-changing. He finally lowered the shotgun. "My name is Elias." He had no idea what to do. The situation was so far beyond his experience, it felt like a dream. He was a plain man. He understood fences, cattle, weather, and the ache of loneliness. He did not understand this. He brought the pony, laden with its gifts, into the lean-to. As he untied the parfleche bags, the scent of smoked meat and strange herbs filled the cold air. It was the scent of a different life, a different world, now tethered to his own. Inside the cabin, Istis had taken one of the new blankets, a thick, beautiful thing woven with patterns of red and black, and folded it neatly at the foot of the bed. His bed, their bed. The implication hung in the air, as tangible as the wood smoke. That night, he laid his pallet on the floor, same as always. He could feel her watching him from the bed. The silence was not comfortable anymore. It was charged, electric with unspoken questions. He lay awake for hours, staring into the embers of the fire, his mind a storm of confusion and a strange, terrifying sort of hope. The next day, a circuit rider, a preacher named Mr. Blackwood who passed through the territory twice a year, appeared at his door, half-frozen and looking for shelter. He was a thin man, with a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards. He took in the scene: Elias, the quiet Apache girl, the new blanket on the bed with shrewd, watery eyes. "Found yourself some company, Elias?" Blackwood said, warming his hands by the fire. It was not a question. "Something like that," Elias grunted. Later, over a stew made with the tribe's dried meat, Blackwood cleared his throat. "It ain't proper, Elias. The girl being here. People will talk." "Let them," Elias said, his voice flat. He looked over at Istis. She was eating slowly, her eyes downcast. But he knew she was listening, understanding more than she let on. "She's a heathen's son, unbaptized, living in sin under your roof." Elias put down his spoon. The sound was loud in the small cabin. "She was dying. I took her in. Her people came. They say we're married now, according to their ways." Blackwood stared, his jaw slack. "Married? Good heavens, man. That's pagan nonsense." "Is it?" Elias asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Seemed more honorable than some of the weddings I've seen you perform." The preacher bristled. "This is a Christian land, with Christian laws." Elias felt a surge of something hot and protective in his chest. He looked at Istis, at her quiet dignity, the way she endured, the strength in her silence. He thought of the flower on Sarah's grave. He thought of her people's gifts, their solemn promise. And he thought of the world Blackwood represented, a world that would have left her to die in a ditch. "Then maybe you should make it a Christian marriage," Elias said. The words surprised him as much as they did the preacher. They came from a place he didn't know he had, a place that had decided, without his permission, to stand his ground. Blackwood gaped at him. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Elias said. He turned to Istis. He didn't know how to ask. He didn't have the words. He just looked at her and hoped she understood. He was offering her the only protection he could from the judgment of his world. A name, piece of paper, a ceremony. She met his gaze. Her dark eyes searched his for a long time. She was not just looking at him. She was seeing him, all the way down to the lonely, broken parts. Then, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. One single motion. Yes. And so, by the light of a flickering lamp, with the wind howling outside, the Reverend Blackwood performed the strangest wedding of his career. He stumbled through the vows, his voice laced with disapproval. Elias spoke his part in a low, steady murmur. When it was Istis's turn, she was silent. She must consent, Blackwood insisted, his face pinched. Elias looked at her. Istis, he said, her name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. Yes, she said, her voice a whisper that cut through the preacher's sanctimony. I will. There was no ring. He had buried Sarah's with her. Instead, when the grim ceremony was over, he took her hand. It was small and cool in his. He held it for a moment longer than necessary. A new vow, an unspoken one. That night, he did not lay his pallet by the fire. He added more wood to the hearth until the cabin was warm and filled with a soft, orange glow. He took the extra blanket and folded it beside the one Istis had laid out. He hesitated, then went to the bed and lay down on top of the covers on his side, his back to her. The space between them was a vast, uncharted territory. He lay perfectly still, listening to the sound of her breathing, the crackle of the fire, the beating of his own heart. After a long time, he felt a slight shift in the mattress. A small, warm weight settled against his back. It was not a passionate gesture. It was one of solace, of trust, of two lonely people finding anchor in a storm. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he did not dream of ghosts. Life did not magically become easy. It was still a hard land, and winter was long. But it was different. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was a shared quiet, full of understanding that ran deeper than words. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the meaning in her glances. He learned that she hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when she was content. She learned that he drank his coffee black and that he had a temper as slow and dangerous as a thawing river. She began to change the cabin slowly. A pot of herbs appeared on the windowsill. The scent of pine and something else, something wild and sweet, began to permeate the logs. She wove a small, colorful mat for the floor by the hearth. She was not erasing Sarah's memory. She was simply making space for her own. One day he was fixing a broken harness, his fingers clumsy with cold. She came and stood beside him, watching. Then she took the leather and the awl from his hands. Her fingers were nimble and sure. She stitched the leather with a skill he could not match, her movements precise and economical. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, watching her. "My father," she said, without looking up. It was the most she had ever offered about her past. A small, precious stone of information. He did not ask for more. He just nodded and accepted the gift. Spring came, painting the hills in tentative green. The creek began to run again, and the air smelled of damp earth and new life. He found he was smiling more, a strange, rusty feeling in the muscles of his face. He would catch her watching him, and the ghost of a smile would touch her own lips. Section. He gave her a new name one afternoon, while they were planting a small garden. "Istis is hard to say," he admitted, feeling foolish. "Lena, does that sound all right to you?" She considered it, her head tilted. "Lena," she repeated, tasting the sound. She nodded. Lena, it was another thread, tying them together. The past, however, was not as distant as they hoped. A man named Cutler, a rancher from the next valley with a reputation for greed and a cruel streak, rode up to their cabin one day. He had two hard-faced men with him. Cutler had been one of the men in a party of vigilantes who had attacked the Apache camp, a fact Elias had pieced together from whispers in town. He was a man who believed the only good Apache was a dead one. "Heard you were keeping a squaw here, Elias," Cutler said, his voice a greasy sneer. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boots. Elias moved to stand in front of the cabin door, blocking it. Lena was inside. "She's my wife," he said, his voice even. Cutler laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Wife? You can't marry a savage. She's property, spoils of war. I should have claimed her myself when we ran them off. You touch this cabin, you touch her," Elias said, his voice dropping low, "and you'll find out just how Christian I am." He didn't have his shotgun. He hadn't expected trouble, but his hands were balled into fists at his sides. "Are you threatening me, widower?" Cutler sneered, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. The cabin door opened. Lena stepped out. She did not have a weapon. She just stood there, straight and proud, her eyes burning with a cold fire that Elias had never seen before. She looked at Cutler and she spoke. Not in English. She spoke in her own tongue, her voice sharp and ringing with authority. It was not a plea. It was a judgment. Cutler and his men shifted, unnerved by the language they didn't understand, by the sheer force of her presence. Then she did something that shocked them all. She looked Cutler dead in the eye, and she spat on the ground at his horse's feet, a gesture of ultimate contempt. For a second, fury contorted Cutler's face. He started to dismount, his hand grabbing for his gun. But then a new sound joined the tense standoff. The sound of hoofbeats. Over the ridge, just as they had before, came 3 riders. It was the old man and 2 others. They did not ride fast. They simply appeared, their presence a silent, powerful statement. They held rifles across their laps. They were not there for a conversation. Cutler saw them. The color drained from his face. He looked from the Apache riders, to the defiant woman on the porch, to the unyielding man standing before her. He had come for an easy prize. He had found a fortress. He cursed, a low, vicious sound, and yanked his horse's reins. "This ain't over," he snarled, but there was no conviction in it. He and his men turned and rode away, their departure hasty and lacking dignity. Elias watched them go. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He turned. Lena, Istis, was still standing there. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by a slight tremor in her hands. He walked up the steps and, without thinking, put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, just for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the fear they had shared and overcome. The old man rode forward, stopping where he had before. He looked at them, standing together on the porch. He nodded once, a sign of approval. Then, he and his men melted back into the landscape as silently as they had come. That evening, the silence in the cabin was deeper, more peaceful than ever before. They sat by the fire, Elias cleaning his shotgun, Lena mending a tear in his coat. The life they had built was no longer an accident. It was a choice. It had been tested, and it had held. He looked at her, the firelight catching the blue-black shine of her hair. He thought of the empty years behind him, the hollow silence of his grief. He thought of the woman he had found, a broken thing of dust and blood. And he looked at the woman who sat before him now, his wife, a person of immense strength and quiet grace. He reached out and laid his hand over hers. She stopped her sewing and turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. Her skin was warm, real. "I was scared," he admitted, the words feeling small in the great quiet. She looked at him, her dark eyes soft in the firelight. "I know," she said. "I was not." He knew what she meant. She had not been scared for herself. She had been scared for him. And in that moment he understood. This was not a story of rescue. It was a story of 2 solitudes meeting and making a home. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Outside, the stars were brilliant in the cold, clear sky. The prairie was vast and empty. But inside the small log cabin, the 2 of them sat together, their hands intertwined, a single steady light against the great dark. The house breathed around them, no longer a tomb of memory, but a cradle of a new and fragile life. And it was enough. It was more than enough. This story, it ain't just about a man saving a woman. It's about how sometimes the thing you think you're rescuing is actually the thing that's come to rescue you. It's about how the deepest bonds aren't forged with grand words or fancy promises, but in the silent spaces between 2 people. In a shared meal, a mended coat, a flower left on a grave. We all carry our own ghosts, our own lonely cabins of the heart. We build fences around ourselves to keep the pain out and end up keeping the life out, too. But every now and then, If you're brave enough to answer the call of a soul in need, if you're willing to offer a little warmth against the cold, you might find that the life you save is your own. So here is your naming. Not a label given by others, but the one you choose for yourself when you decide to stand for something. When you decide to protect, to care, to build. That's the moment you stop being just a survivor and start becoming a sanctuary. And if you're brave, if you're truly brave, you might just find that someone has been waiting to build it with you all along. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them,